I think we can now start our class. Am I audible, sir?
Yes, sir. Audible, audible. Yes.
Okay, so I think it's time we can start our lecture for today.
Okay, okay.
So basically, I don't know if the recording has started or not. Because there's no option to record uh, there. I guess that the streaming must have started. Uh, Basically, the title of our today's lecture is Jain culture in Delhi, tangible, intangible heritage. Sir, you are saying something?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yes, sir. You can say, sir. So basically, it is a continuation of something which I have discussed in the last lecture I took regarding the existence of Jainism in the popular culture. So when we talk about Jainism, so Jain tourism, we are often talking about how it exists in the realm of uh, structures, in the realm of tourism, in the realm of monuments. But beyond the monumentality, Jainism has a very strong presence in the everyday life of people. The people who don't belong to that religion, who don't follow that religion, they are also occupied with that Jain culture in some or the other way. So, as we have discussed earlier, that Jainism as a practicing religion is something uh, that exists as a in certain pockets, right? The Delhi, fortunately, is one of the places where Jainism, the population of Jain people, is comparatively higher than compared to other states, and is one of the areas where the population is more than 1 lakh. So, in that context, we find there are certain pockets within Delhi where we find the active practice of Jainism through monumentality, but otherwise also in the sense of how Jainism exists as a culture. Right. So, if you see the 2011 census, Delhi is the seventh highest region in terms of Jain population with 1,66,231 uh, Jain people residing here, about 1% approximately. So there is ought to be some kind of visible visual relevance of Jainism in that area, and particularly we find this in the way Jain community have tried to express themselves. Despite being minority, they have tried to create a niche for themselves, and they have tried to create uh, certain pockets where they can exercise their cultural significance. So Jain as a community has very strong presence in the history of Delhi, and it has a very strong historical element. It has a very strong historicity associated with it. Why Jains have been able to assert themselves culturally is something which is related to their origins or basically their development in the Middle Ages, right? So, now what we can find that in today's time, there are at least 165 Jain temples that exist in Delhi, right? And many of them, the emergence of or the development of Jainism as a monumental and cultural force can be seen in the medieval centuries, wherein the Tomar rulers, Tomars of the who were ruling Delhi, they were the ones who patronized Jainism very strongly, right? And one of the earliest uh, references to Jainism in India can be found in from this century onward, from the Tomar rulers only, Vibhuti Sridhar's Pashanacharya, which is basically the Charit literature of Parshavnath. Right, so Parshavnath was a Jain, ascetic Jain Tirthankar, and Charyu is a Charit literature, right, which deals with the character of, or basically the, uh, what you can say, the religious literature of the Jain, right? It has a very strong reference, but we cannot say that okay, Jainism didn't have existence or didn't have references prior to that. The earliest epigraphical evidence of the Jains can be seen from the Ashokan inscription, where we find reference of the Nirgranth Sikh, right? So Nirgranth Sikh, the Ashokan inscription talk about the seventh pillar inscription of Ashoka. Here we see the emergence of the reference to Jainism. And you already know that this is the kind of inscription, the seventh pillar inscription, which was originally not based in Delhi, right? Now it is in Firozshah Kotla, but initially it was in Topara, Yamuna Nagar, right? In the Yamuna Nagar region, there's a region called Topara, and it's a very interesting story that is associated with it, right? So it was brought about by Firozshah Tughlaq, who was because and this tells you how peculiar and how myopic the memory, the cultural memory of people is, right? So the story says that Firozshah Tughlaq was very much interested in those tall Ashokan pillars because he was told that okay, these are Lat of Bhim, right? So basically, in popular culture, the Ashokan inscription that were based in Yamunanagar was supposed to be the walking sticks of him, right? So he brought them to the current position in Firozshah Kotla, and he asked the scholars to read the inscription, but they were not able to because it was written in Brahmi, right? So what happened that they started saying, okay, this inscription say, till the time a ruler named Firozshah Tughlaq comes to the throne, nobody will be able to uh, uh, pull out this pillar from his place, right? So basically, it was a kind of opportunistic tradition that facilitated the development of other sects apart from Islam in the medieval centuries, and that is something that we find in in terms of Jainism as well. How Jain scholars and Jain ascetics, they made use of the tradition, they made use of uh, they made use of all the kind of cultural edifices that they found in the Delhi Sultanate at the Mughal period, and they were able to develop themselves during this period despite the very strong wave of Islam that was emerging during this period. Right. So why is the reference to Ashoka to Nirgranthas in the Ashokan inscription is important because we don't find the reference to Nirgranthas uh, in any other inscription of Ashok, and he specifically mentions certain sects, right? So the very presence of these kind of names, right? That you are talking about the Brahmin, the Ajivika, the Nirgrantha, the Buddhist, right? Uh, tells you that there must have been a certain kind of presence of these sects in the territory that allowed Ashoka to make such a comment. Right. So Ashok actually talks about appointing certain officials, senior officials, who can look after certain these kind of sects. And in this kind of conditioning, in this kind of condition, he talks about the Nirgrantha sect, which scholars point out that it basically deals with the Jainas. Right. We also know that in if you read the Jain text, they refer to Ashok as a Jain. Right. Similarly, we find there are many scholars, many figures that the Jain text calls Jain and the Buddhist text calls Buddhism. So basically, there is always a tussle. Even Bimbadhara, Ajat this is we find the reference that how they are being considered as uh, Jainas, right? Now, uh, but we find that Jainas kept emerging or kept developing themselves despite the fact that their presence was limited to certain kind of pockets. And Buddhism was able to loom large. Buddhism was able to dominate the proceedings of the Indian subcontinent. Despite that fact, Jainism never saw that kind of a glorious, uh, glorious kind of upstart or glorious kind of development, but it never also saw this kind of very strong decline that Buddhism saw in the Middle Ages. So Jainas were able to assert themselves culturally through the different kind of cultural tradition. It was their culture, it was the culture of the Jains, which was able to facilitate throughout the ages. And in this context, we are specifically referring to the Delhi region. Why? Because Delhi in the medieval centuries became a epicenter of power with the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal period, and it is here that Jainas were able to assert themselves through culture and economic maneuvering. Right. First of all, there are two, three major reasons why Jains were able to assert themselves in the context of Delhi. First of all, they were able to seek legitimization from the rulers, particularly the Khilji rulers and the Tughlaq rulers, and later on under the auspices of Akbar and Jahangir. So these were the people who actually patronized Jainism in their own capacity, even though when they were acting as staunch Muslims. Right? That's first thing. Second thing, most of the Jain people, they were with the mercantile communities, and they were very important in the trading community, in the trading tradition, right? And because we already know that one of the three major reasons for the influx of the Turkish and the Arabic people into and Persian people into the Indian subcontinent, the God, glory, and gold, it was basically gold, right? Because it was very closely linked to the trading center, it was closely linked to the trading route. through which a large amount of trade was being conducted, they cannot actually negate, or they cannot uh, ignore that mercantile community uh, of the Jainas. One of the major things that we discussed in the last class as well was the reference to Arthakathanak. So we know Arthakathanak is a book written by Banarsi Das. So Banarsi Das was a person who, it is also considered one of the earliest autobiographies that was being written during this period, right? So he actually talks about how Jain followers were also involved in certain kinds of syncretic tradition. They were involved in syncretic values, right? Why? Because they were not just limited to worshipping the Jain cult, right? But they were also involved in worshipping the Hindu deities. There was a set of pilgrimages. So if you read Arthakathanak, he talks about the pilgrimages to the Devis, and he talks about how uh, there was a constant influx of people who were doing this pilgrimage to the Hindu deities, right? So Jainism was tried to become comparatively more flexible in its assertion uh, to survive in a kind of competitive climate. Now we find the Jain community was able to assert themselves in two ways: one as an individual, other as a community. Right. When talking about individual, we find references to so many individuals who are working as a capacity of officers, who are working as a capacity uh, of treasurers, of writers, of astrologers, of scholars. There were different kind of ways through which they were able to put themselves visible. They were able to make themselves visible in the whole apparatus, right? So Alauddin Khalji, Kutubuddin Mubarak, uh, then later on Firoz Shah Tughlaq, Muhammad bin Tughlaq, these were the people who were catering to the Jain people as in an individual capacity. They may not cater to the Jain as a organized religion, but they were catering to Jain people as an individual, and that was the reason why Jainism was able to survive. At the same time, there were other centers where Jainism was able to assert themselves politically as well. Particularly, we find the region of Malwa. Right, Malwa was a region where Jainism was becoming more and more important. So, in politics, in administration, in construction, every field, Jainas were able to assert themselves in a very strong way. Right. So this was a very important reason why uh, Jainas were able to assert themselves in the medieval period. Another thing was the emergence of Jain literature, right? So we know a lot of emergence of Jain literature in Kannada, in Sanskrit, in Prakrit, right? So they were able to collect and compile a lot of literature, right, in this context. And this was also the emergence of certain kind of trading communities like the Agarwals, right? So the Agarwals were prominent in asserting the value of the Jain tirthas, the Jain literature, right? This was an important thing. Now, moving on from basically the Delhi Sultanate, we move on to the if you move on to the Mughal period, as I told you, Akbar and Jahangir, they were the very important rulers who patronized, particularly Akbar. Akbar patronized Jainism more than he patronized Hinduism, right? And we find that he was the one uh, who actively participated in legitimizing and asserting the value of Jain scholars, right? And he was the one who gave the Hari Vijay Suri the epithet of Jagat Guru, right? So Jainism was a very prominent idea in this context. Now, Jainendra Suri also wrote a book called Akbar Prati Bodh Rath. Now, this is here I want to just digress a bit and talk about how this was also the period when there were scholars. It was not a one-way process. It was not that Akbar was doing something for the Jains, but rather it was a two-way process wherein the the Jain scholars, the Jain monks, the Jain authors, they were trying to seek legitimization for their own religion, for their own cult, by asserting, by basically uh, writing panegyrics, eulogies, right? So, for example, there were the Upanishads written Allo Upanishad. There were people who were writing eulogies on Akbar. Right, Akbar was called by all the kind of epithet that exist in the world. In that realm, we can understand the creation of works like Akbar Pratibodharas because it was a political act. It was an act to assert the legitimization of the Jain community, and it was a way for the Jains to secure endowment, to secure monetary gains, to secure legitimization. Right. So basically, this was a political goal for the Jain scholars, for the Jain monks to assert themselves politically, to assert themselves culturally. Right. So it had actually positive influence on the community. For example, when Jahangir was came to the throne after Akbar, he continued to some extent uh, the to some extent, he continued this idea of Akbar to mobilize to support Jainism, right? So even after Janasuri, right, the titles like Yuga Pradhan, these were bestowed upon the Jain scholars, Mahatapa, right? Also, we find how these Jain people were writing a lot of literature during this period. So they were being given patronage by the Mughal rulers, right? So Ardh Kathanak was written in the 16th century, and if you Ardh Kathanak, Banarsi Das was writing that when we heard about the death of Akbar, everyone was falling apart, everyone was crying bitterly, they were becoming unconscious, everything was happening in this context, right? So it shows how there was a symbiotic relation, there was a kind of two-way relation through which they were able to uh, legitimize themselves, they were able to secure political legitimacy, right? So this is an important thing. There are a lot of these kind of places that were being made. For example, Sangpati, Ratnashi, Sanghavi, Rishabh Das. So they were basically developing certain kind of temples in Agra, in Delhi, right? In 1658, we find the one of the oldest temples that we find in Delhi, right? One of the oldest temples that we find in Delhi can be seen in this context. But this process ended by the time we reach 18th century, but with the coming of second half of the 17th century and the 18th century, because Aurangzeb was not a kind of ruler who was supporting these kind of values, right? Not because he was uh, anti to Jainism, but rather because uh, Aurangzeb was comparatively more orthodox Muslim, right? And he was more inclined towards ulemas, right? It is not that he did something bad for the Jain community, but that frequency of Jain patronage was something that was not found in this context. Also, uh, we when there's one certain problematic thing that happened in this period as well, right? Particularly, we find that how different places were turned into mosques, right? So the conversion of different religious places into mosques created a sense of identity politics in the modern times. So, if you know the Kangra Fort, in the Kangra Fort, there is a mosque which was initially a Jain temple. So it works as a Jain temple, it works as a Devi temple, and it works as a mosque. Similarly, we find the Qutub Minar, right? The Jain temples were reused to create a Hindu temple, and it was used to create the Qutub Minar, right? So basically, what we find that there is always a kind of uneasy relation, right? Very uneasy relation that exists between the Sultanate rulers and the Jain culture, right? So, in that context, we can see the emergence, the present condition of Jains in Delhi, right? Because there are two, three different type of people that exist as Jain in Delhi. First are the people who are able to assert themselves, who are able to exist uh, throughout the Sultanate period and are living continuously. There is a continuous chain of their existence from the time of the Tomar till the times of till the modern time. Second are the mercantile class, the merchants and the traders who were actively involved in the trading. And because this was a kind of region which was included in the trading center, that's why they were able to assert themselves. Third are the Jain monks, the Shvetambara and the Digambara tradition of Jainism, right? So Jainism exists in Delhi in multiple ways, and as I was saying in the last class as well, it exists more as a culture than as a religion, right? It exists more through individuals who are able to create a niche for themselves, who are able to assert themselves in the cultural sense, right? So basically, we find the emergence of certain kind of religious tradition. We find the emergence of mathas, the tirthas, all these kind of things. But before I talk to about the temples, because temples is something that is very obvious in our understanding of Jainism, but there are other things as well that we need to understand, like Jain cuisine, right? Jain tourist places. So basically, I was just saying that for 3,000 rupees, uh, Delhi, there are organizations in Delhi which organize a Jain tour, right? They organize a Jain tour, and the tour is both culinary as well as cultural, right? It's an intermixture of culinary and cultural kind of apparatus, wherein they provide you access to those kind of mathas and the tirthas and the temples that exist in this context. Uh, but at the same time, they also allow you to relish culinary or Jain dishes, right? And what is important about these kind of food cuisines is that they are completely vegetarian, and this has become a two ways. One, they have created their own niche in terms of culinary segment. That okay, there are separate restaurants serving separate Jain thali, which actually, if you know, if the Jain thali, you know it will be vegetarian. You know it will be bereft of garlic, onions, etc. Right. So first of all, it creates a kind of culinary effect. Second thing, it's the assertion of identity. Right. You are trying to differentiate yourself from other communities, saying, okay, see, we assert ourselves very strongly in terms of non-violence, right? And Jan Thali is a kind of predicament. It is a kind of symbol of our non-violence, of our vote to non-violence, right? And it is not something that has created in the modern time, but rather it has existed since many centuries, right? So what we find that the merchant classes that I talked about, the second community, the merchant classes, these were largely Jains or Brahmins. So even when in the Mughal period, the Mughal cuisine was developed, right? The Mughal cuisine was developed, which is very much influenced from the from the Persian cuisine, right? So basically, when this was happening, uh, the Jains were trying to assert themselves in alternative ways. They were trying to assert themselves in ways through which they can keep their culinary culture intact, their identity intact. Right. So it is not just about food, but it is about how you are able to assert yourself, how you are able to identify yourself, differentiate yourself. Right. So the vegetarian, the basically focus and the strong focus on vegetarian food is something that is very prominent in the culture assertion. And you will find in Delhi, if you search for Jain Thali, you will find at least 11 restaurants which specifically have the menu. In a particular region, you will find almost every thali, every big restaurant have a Jain Thali. Right. The Jain Thali is basically an assertion of their cuisine. Right. And it is one of the rarest cuisines which has remained unchanged over the years. Right. So this is something very important for us. Second thing is that how Jainism is able to assert themselves uh, in terms of non-violent assertion. Right. So they are not just eschewing non-veg, but they are eschewing things like garlic, onion, potatoes, even curd, yogurt. Right. Why is that? So basically, it can be seen the formative assertion of this can be seen in their ancient history. Right. We know that Jains are wary of things which involve any kind of violence in any way. So basically, even if you use a very simplistic thing like a curd, right? Even that curd is something which is associated with killing of bacteria. Bacteria are, or the microorganisms are the ones who are able to, who actually create uh, curd, right? So this kind of eschewing of the uh, non any kind of thing which has to do with violence, right? Plucking of the stems or plucking of the roots to eat food is strictly prohibited. So William Dalrymple has actually worked upon this idea that how the nuns, they are so very conscious about how they are going to eat, right? They are how they are boiling their water, how they are basically eating that kind of food which doesn't involve, which involve least amount of violence. You cannot actually, right? Which doesn't involve even an iota of violence. So basically, they are using filters in their mouth so that even accidentally they are not able to commit any kind of violence, right? Even if there are any microorganism, it gets filtered out. So this kind of an assertion, this kind of an identity has emerged in a very major way. Jain food or Jain restaurant has become a kind of fashion, and this is another important thing that I think I touched upon in the last lecture. That how religion can become a part of religion can become a lifestyle or a fashion, right? So people who may not be following Jainism as a religion, they are following Jain diet or Jain food or Jain snacks because it is healthy. It is comparatively healthy. It is comparatively less fat, less carbohydrate, right? And therefore, those people who want to seek a kind of a dietary habit, a healthy diet habit, they are trying to seek the Jain thalis, right? Or those people who believe in the purity of food material, who are proper vegan people, they are seeking Jain thali. So Jain thali is not something that is only related to the Jain people. It has become a statement of uh, health. It has become a statement of uh, identity politics. It has become a sense of fashion, right? Those people who are doing it not because they believe in it, but because they believe that it is oriented toward, is a favorable toward their lifestyle, right? So in Delhi, in particularly metropolitan area, and I'm talking about Delhi, Jainism exists as fashion, right? So this is a rubric that we can talk about is Jainism as fashion. Another thing, another idea that is related to Jainism in fashion is the idea of art and decoration. If you search for Jain art, you will find multiple shops that are selling Jain art and sculpture, right? So basically, these kind of Jain art form, these kind of what you call the showpieces. So basically, uh, it is either meant for liturgical purpose or it is meant for just for leisure, right? So those people who don't actually believe in Jainism, they may not even understand what the major tenets of Jainism, right? So they buy these kind of goods, they buy Jain cut, Jain sculptures, and they keep in their home, not because they believe in it or they understand it, but just because it looks good, it is fashionable, it is trendy, right? So can we actually talk about those kind of culture tradition that exist uh, out of context, that exist not without understanding the context of the religion or context of the culture? And most of the modern people, most of the urban spaces, people follow a particular cultural trend, a particular religious trend out of fashion. This is true for Delhi as well, right? So this is another important thing that we can talk about. Now, when we talk about Jainism, the next thing that comes to our mind is how these Jains are able to assert themselves through their community, right? So, in terms of community, we find that how there are separate community centers, there are separate people who are asserting themselves and Jains, right? Uh, there are particular schools that are devoted to Jain community, or they are dominating in this context. If you last few years ago, I was looking at the board of Rayan International School, and I was saying the toppers list, and it was I saw lines of people, Jain, and I thought about it. But is that the representation of Jains higher in this school, or the Jains are actually intelligent enough to secure these kind of positions, right? And the answer could be both, right? Because Jains are very prominent community in terms of trading and in terms of philanthropy, right? They have a much stronger presence in terms of community than they have as a practicing religion, right? So they are able to develop, they are able to develop the different kind of schools and institutions and religious groups, right? And many a time they are devoted to philanthropy in more than one way, right? For example, we find the reference to these the Jain temple, right? The Lal Mandir. Now, the Lal Mandir, why is it important? Lal Mandir is important because it is not just a temple. It is one of the oldest temple of Jainas in Delhi, one of the oldest, right? And 1658 it was created, right? And later on it was renovated many a time. So what happened that they developed a veterinary clinic in that region, and I think this is one of the largest veterinary clinic in Delhi. Right. Why? Because Jainism is the one kind of religion which believes very strongly in the idea of non-violence towards all creatures, animate and inanimate. So it's not just that Jainism is focusing on caring about people, humans, but rather it is talking about caring about all the kind of beings, right? And for that purpose, we find that they have developed a lot many centers, right? So it emerged as a center of philanthropy, center of service, right? This is another thing, and this is something that is related to the intrinsic belief system of Jainism, wherein the Tirthankaras are not you are not doing something to ask for someone's favor, right? The Jainas as a community are not doing something to ask for favor, but rather it is a way for them to show off their they show their proclivity, they show their surrender to the Jain Tirthankaras, right? So basically, it has been said that Jainas never are in Abhay Mudra, particularly because they are not giving you blessings. If you are worshipping the Jain Tirthankar, you are doing it out of your own will. It is not something that is encouraged. It is not something that will bestow you anything, right? So the idea of service, the idea of surrender, the idea of selflessness is something that is very deeply imbibed in the cultural ethics of Jainism, and that's why we find that there are so many institutions, organizations which are dealing with education, health, infrastructure development. All these things are developed by Jains in a very major manner. So if you can see this list, there are so many groups, there are so many different kind of classes which are uh, uh, basically dealing with Jainism. They are in some way or the other, they are communities of Jains who are working uh, uh, for the development of their own community as well as for the Jain temple, right? Ashok Vihar, Jain Shwetambar Tees, right? Uh, Attavalam Sanskriti Tees, Vedinpura, Digambar Jain Tees, Digambar Lal Mandir, Mahavir Bhavan, Shwetambar Mandir, Agarwal Digambar Jain Mandir. And this is a very interesting thing. How Jainism became associated with other groups, other trading classes, particularly the Agarwal. So it is said that when 11th, 12th century, the uh, Jainism became prominent, particularly among the Rajputs of Rajasthan, and those people were coming to Delhi, like the Tomar, right? So what basically is happening is that there is a syncretic tradition that is developing within the among the Jains and the trading community. So Agarwals were the one of the communities who were accepting Jainism because it is something Jainism is very conducive to the uh, trading community, right? You know that Jainism, if you we have try to understand the basic tenets of Jainism, there are a lot of rules and regulations that are detrimental for different kind of occupations. So basically, if you can't dig the land because it will kill the insects, or you can't burn the fire because it will kill people, right? So trading is becomes a very major occupation of the people who patronize Jainism, right? So Jainism was particularly patronized by either the ruling classes, right? It's very ironical that those people are patronizing Jainism who are involved in uh, violence in a major way, or those Rajput rulers. Basically, for them, Jainism is a way for to amend their sins, right? So patronizing Jainism becomes a important way for them to amend their sins. So the trading community is a very direct, is a very relevant kind of intervention, right? So they are able to assert themselves, they are able to develop themselves in that particular, right? So basically, that's why we find the very strong presence of the trading classes in these regions. So Mehroli is a very important region. Dadabadi. We'll try to understand this community. The Dadabadi in the Chandni Chowk region, we find a lot of Digambar Lal Mandir. Right. These are some important uh, religious spaces that exist in Delhi. And but that doesn't mean that this is the only thing. So if we try to understand certain prominent Jain temples or Jain structure that we find in Delhi, right? So first of all, Jain Nigampa temple that I've talked about many times. Okay. This is something that it is red in color, but it also show uh, certain kind of structures which are according to the Jain architecture, right? So basically, this is the Chandpak Jain temple, and this is the one which we find in the Mehroli region. If you see, this is very similar to what we also find in the regions of the Mount Abu, right? The Dilwara temple structure is very similar to that. And so basically, Jain architecture has a very strong presence in these regions as well, right? So first of all, the Jain temples that were being created in this in Delhi, right? So the first one is the Digambar Jain temple, which is one of the earliest temples. 1658 it was formed, and later on it was amended in the 18th and 19th century. It also has free bird hospitals, right? The other one is the Shri Atma Vallabha Jain Smarak, right? So this is a place where we find not just a temple but also a museum. Right. So these are the kind of structures which actually survive on donations or and the patronage by the rich Jain merchant classes. And these Jain merchant classes continuously patronize those kind of work which try to create a sense of identity of the Jains in the region. Particularly, we find in the region of Old Delhi, right? Rana Sabvi has worked on this region, and she has pointed out how the Jain temples exist in a major way uh, in many of the structures, right? So what happened that in the regions of Purani Delhi, right? There are a lot of regions that were created as Jain temple and later on became mosque. And later on, these structures were reinstated in the form of uh, mosque, right? This is something we find in this context, right? So for example, the Lal Mandir, it was initially formed in the region of Shahjahanabad, which is the old Delhi by Shah Jahan, right? So basically, there was a Jain soldier in their army, and he kept three idols of him in the region, right? So basically, from there it blossomed into a old temple. Particularly, these temples were being patronized by the by the Khatri and the Jain community, right? So basically, they were creating many kind of Jain temples, and even Shah Jahan was patronizing these kind of spaces, right? So there were fort palaces, ornate gates, bulwarks, waterways, gardens, all kind of things were being created in this context, right? Dharampura, they were creating Jain temple, Karsani, and this was not just limited to Shah Jahan. It continued under the rule of Akbar Shah to Muhammad Shah Rangila, Bahadur Shah, right? Uh, we find in the 19th century Naya Jain Mandir, Dharampura. So basically, this was very important in this context. How they were creating different kind of temples, different kind of structure. They were patronizing different kind of structures. Right, Digambar Jain Meru Temple, which is now a recognized site, right, a heritage site, which is under the protection of INTAC. Right. So this is also an important thing how these spaces are being incorporated, and this is very important thing how in the 19th century these structures change their form, right? Which we call the colonial interpretation or intervention, right? Muological modality. Uh, how these structures, which were for a very long time, were active centers of pilgrimage, were active centers of worshipping. These centers became uh, associated with museum by structures, right? So basically, what happened that Britishers were trying to see these places as site of tourism. Now, there's a very basic difference between pilgrimage and tourism. Tourism doesn't really require you to be a follower or even remotely be sensitive about their cultural significance or cultural subjectivity, right? For you, it is a structure which is supposed to be looked upon in terms of their architecture, their sculpture, their painting, their all the kind of symbolic meaning. But it is not, you don't need to be sympathetic or empathetic or a believer to view a structure in terms of their architecture. But when a site is a pilgrimage, it becomes associated with worshipping, it becomes associated with meditation, it becomes associated with liturgy. So the liturgical element was taken away from these temples, the sacrality was taken away, the desacralization of these structures were taking place because the Britishers were seeing all these structures as a potential site of tourism, right? They were seeing it as tourist site. And this is a very major change that was brought in the 19th century, right? And which continue to assert itself even in the modern time. How these sites became associated with ASI, Intact, all these kind of institutions, which are dealing with restoration of heritage. They are not really making them sacred spaces, right? So this is one important thing that we need to understand. The one criticism of any kind of tourism or tourist project is that even though it creates a lot of scope for the emergence of economic resources, economic funding, right, and creates a lot of space for the space for the region to become popular, right, and acquire a kind of mainstream acceptance. At the same time, we also find that these structures become more and more desacralized. Right, these no spaces no longer remain active spaces of worshipping. They became passive means for gazing the location. Right. So this is one of the major criticism that we can talk about in this context. Right. Uh, Another thing that we find apart from that was the Naya Mandir. Naya Mandir was formed by Raja Harsukh Rai. It was created in Dharampura, Old Delhi, 1807, under Akbar II. Now, we have to be certain, this is Akbar II. Right? 8 lakh rupees. 8 lakh rupees is a very princely sum in the 19th century. Right? So basically, it was a very high sum in this context. Right? And they also create a shikhar. Shikhar is, the shikhar is a lofted structure, a kind of lofted building that you find in the architecture of Jain, of the Nagara architecture in a particular manner, right? So, why is called the Naya Mandir? Because the old, the Purana Mandir जो है, वो लाल मंदिर है. Lal Mandir that we talked about in the Chandni Chowk is basically considered to be the Purana Mandir. So basically, this temple is considered the Naya Mandir, right? Third place is Ahimsa Sthal. Ahimsa Sthal is the Jain temple, right? A monolithic structure, a single stone structure of 5 meter approximately of the Shankar Mahavir is found in this context, right? So this is something which is they are trying to emulate the Bahubali structure. Bahubali structure is comparatively 70 to 80 meter. This is 30 tons of structure, right? And then it is surrounded by a large garden. Then the fourth place, which is important for us, is the Dadabadi in Mehrwali, right? Which I showed you the picture. it is basically considered to be the place where the Dada Guru, the Jain Chandra Suri, who was given epithet by Akbar and Jahangir. So basically, he was cremated, right? So basically, when he was on his deathbed, right, he said that he his forehead had the money, right, a very important money, right, and he said that okay, take my money and put it in a bowl of milk, right, and this is how we find the representation of uh, the Jin Chandra Suri, right. So basically, people were very sad on his death, right, and they forgot to add to remove that money and keep it in the milk bowl, right? And basically, they kept the body on the ground. But as soon as they put the body on the ground, it refused to budge. It was not there was hardly any way they were able to move it, right? They were not even able to move it when they used elephants, right? If you try to see this structure in today's time, you will find that this is very much parallel located to the Qutub Minar. You can see the Qutub Minar from here, and from the that structure. It is in a higher pedestal, and it's a very enormous and a very good looking kind of structure that we find in this context. So basically, the story goes on like that they were not able to move that structure at any cost, right? And basically, they had to place it at the spot where it is placed even now, right? So, Jainism, all in all, is a kind of structure, is a kind of space which was able to where in Delhi, where it exists as monumental structure, but it also exists as a culture. So we talked about Buddhism as fashion. We talked about liturgical value. We talked about its cuisine. A very important thing we forgot in the idea of cuisine was a Jain shikanji. Right, Jain shikanji is not something that is related to Jainism as a religion in any way, but by lending its name to a community who is actively involved in the trading corpus, they are able to keep that spirit of Jainism alive. Right. It is through these spaces that Jainism is able to assert themselves, is able to legitimize itself, and it's able to sustain itself. Right. So it's able to exist culturally. We know that a few years ago in India, Haryana, they brought in a Jain monk to the parliament. We find a lot of Jain uh, uh, value of texts like Kadve Pravachan. If you know the modern day Muni, the Jain Tirthankar Muni, right? They wrote this book called Kadve Pravachan, which was uh, a kind of Niti Vachan, right? A collection of Niti Vachan, and it became a bestseller. So basically, it was received by people who were not really belong to the Jain tradition, but who were eager to absorb, who believe that Jainism is something which has a very strong sacral value, which has a very strong moral value, which has a very strong ethical value. Right? They are trying to assert, they are trying to appreciate and accept Jainism as a ethics, Jainism as culture, Jainism as morals, may not be Jainism as a practicing religion. Right? This is one of the major things that we find in the context of Jainism, and this is how Jainism is able to assert itself in a important way, right? We are uh, so this is something we find, and in terms of structures, we already know there are so many inscriptions, so many literature, Hamir Mahakavya, Ramba Mahamanjari, right? All these kind of literature that was being written in the medieval century that was able to assert itself, that was able to remain relevant in the modern time, right? So basically, this is a kind of brief idea about uh, uh, Jain culture, tangible and intangible heritage in the modern in Delhi. If there's any question, any query, anything that you want to say, you can actually say. Any questions, any query, any comments, any feedback? No? Explain to Pudgala. I didn't understand the question. Pudgala is? एक minute. So basically, you are talking about the idea of Pudgala in. So basically, we are dealing with Pudgala in Jainism, na? So basically, it was something that is that is related to Jainism. You are talking about Pudgala. You want me to explain Pudgala?
Okay, thank you, sir.
I didn't understand your question.
सर एक्चुअली पुटगला सर एक्सप्लेन करना था एक्चुअल मुझे भी इसके बारे में ज्यादा आइडिया नहीं है सर बट ये क्वेश्चन था इसलिए मैंने आपसे पूछा इसके बारे में
ओके ओके तो बिकॉज मेरा जो टॉपिक है ना वो बेसिकली क्योंकि मैं जैन पॉपुलर कल्चर की इसमें डिस्कस कर रहा था आई डोंट हैव मच ऑफ एन आइडिया अबाउट पुडगला ऐसा तो
ओके ओके सर
एनी अदर क्वेश्चन यू वांट टू आस्क Okay, so I think we have discussed covered a lot of questions in relation to Jain culture. Hopefully, we will be discussing a lot more. Right. I consciously didn't discuss the history of Jainism because it was going too long. I wanted to focus on the Jain culture in terms of uh, how it exists in the modern popular culture. Right. So a lot of historical context of it can be lost, but can be very boring and plain. So thank you very much. Hopefully, we will be discussing many more of these topics in future. Thank you.